In a country full of great virtues, but also surrounded by violence, insecurity, and instability. It's no surprise that the men of greatest will use force to seize power and impose order in a convulsed society. A similar scenario is experienced in Colombia in the 50s, when General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla takes power and opens one of the most controversial periods in Colombian history. For some, Rojas Pinilla was a dictator who ferociously pursued his rivals, repressed civil rights, and muzzled the press. For others, he was a man who tried to pacify a nation that was on the path of a civil war, and that in addition he had a marked social and infrastructure policy while the country's middle class was strengthened. For Rojas Pinilla, ensuring peace required not only patriotic nationalism but also the elimination of hunger and the elevation of the most disadvantaged. A figure who, despite his brief tenure, still ignites debates among Colombians. Today we are going to learn about the life of General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla. Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. The little Gustavo Rojas Pinilla was born on March 12, 1900 in the mountainous and cold town of Tunja, being a member of a well-off family composed of conservative military members. He was the son of Julio Rojas Jimenez and Hermencia Pinilla Suarez, with whom he had a happy childhood along with his 5 sisters. In Tunja, he finished his primary and secondary education and was fondly nicknamed Tatayo during his school years. He later emphasized the teaching skills he learned as a child. For in his presidential and political speeches, he always expressed himself in a clear and concise manner, seeking to make his ideas easily understood by the Colombian people. Since gaining independence, Colombia has experienced alternating periods of peace and intense conflicts. The Conservative Party and the Liberal Party were vying for political hegemony. And from 1886 to 1930, it was the Conservatives who maintained control of the government and its institutions. Going back to the 20s in Colombia, Gustavo Rojas Pinilla joined the military school at 17 years old and had a brilliant military career, achieving the rank of second lieutenant. In 1920, his first military activities were carried out in the Tenerife Artillery Regiment in Medellin. In 1923, he moved to the Ayacucho Infantry Regiment in Manizales, where he was an aide to General Marco Alzate, who would be the father of the famous Colombian politician Gilberto Alzate Avendaño. In Manizales, Colombia, Rojas Pinilla is promoted to lieutenant in the army, and in 1924 he asked for permission to retire from active service in order to study civil engineering in the United States. He obtains the title of civil engineer in Indiana in 1927 and a year. Later, he participates in the construction of the important Belén-Socha-San Salvador Highway in Colombia. Rojas Pinilla marries Carolina Correa Londoño, and they have 3 children, Gustavo, Emilio, Maria Eugenia, and Carlos Rojas Correa. These 3 children would inherit their father's taste for politics, especially Maria Eugenia Rojas, who would become a senator of the Republic in the future and a candidate for the presidency of Colombia. By 1930, the Liberals returned to power in Colombia, and a new stage called the Liberal Republic began, which would last until 1946. In 1932, the Colombian-Peruvian War broke out due to territorial conflicts between Colombia and Peru. Therefore, Captain Gustavo Rojas Pinilla returns to the Colombian Army, being assigned to the Bogotá Artillery Group. He performs a prominent role in that war, serving as the commander of the coastal battery and as a military engineer in the region at the port of Buenaventura. Once the war ended in 1936, Rojas Pinilla returns as an engineer of the technical department of the Army's ammunition factory, being sent to the then National Socialist Germany in order to obtain necessary resources to manufacture ammunition in Bogotá. After returning to Colombia, he was appointed head of the technical department responsible for ammunition. Pinilla continues working in the Army and gaining very good prestige in military circles in the midst of World War II. The future President Gustavo Rojas Pinilla has been sent on an official mission in the year 1943 before the United States government for the procurement of weapons and materials for the military forces. There he makes good contacts with influential elements of the United States. By 1945, Rojas Pinilla is appointed Director of Civil Aeronautics. He conducts the landing strips work in Colombia during this activity, which serves as his thesis for his promotion to colonel of the army. It was this thesis where Rojas projected the reputed and future El Dorado Airport in Bogotá, whose construction would be carried out during his presidential term. Until then, our protagonists seemed to have a quiet military life, obtaining promotions and many complications. However, in the year 1948, everything would change for Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, because that year the popular Colombian leader Jorge Eliezer Gaitan would be assassinated on April 9th. Gaitan had been a leader and spokesperson for the Liberal Party, whose charisma and social denunciation won him a multitude of followers in the country, generating suspicion not only in the Conservative Party, but also among many traditional leaders of the Liberal Party and the Colombian business community. As a result of his murder, strong protests and riots broke out in Bogotá, which would later spread to other areas of Colombia. The military man from Tunja, Rojas Pinilla, would be sent to Cali to suppress the rebellion that occurred there. Thanks to his actions in the pacification of the city of Cali and in the Valle de Cauca, Rojas Pinilla receives honors from the Valle Department and from the government of President Mariano Ospina Perez Rojas. He would later say that his work done in Cali had been the best of his military career. Pinilla already enjoyed great prestige in the army. But thanks to his distinctive peacemaking performance in Cali, he is earning the definitive recognition and trust of several of the high commands of politics and the military establishment. On the 11th of October of the following year, in 1949, Pinillas has risen to the rank of general, and on the 18th of October he was assigned to the command of the Brigade of Military Institutes. On the 3rd of December 1949, Rojas assumes his first high civil political position when President Ospina appoints him as Minister of Posts and Telegraphs. Despite the above, Rojas Pinilla's stellar moment would have to wait. The assassination of Gaitan would leave deep consequences in the South American country, initiating the period called by historians as the Violence. After the intense clashes between the government and protesters following Gaitan's death, a part of the liberal leadership orders its militants to rise up in arms against the government, which had been retaken by the conservatives. In 1946, this leads to between 1948 death of Gaitan and 1958 in Colombia. A kind of small war was fought between the liberal and communist guerrillas against the National Army and the National Police, as well as conservative paramilitary groups such as the Chulabitas, the Birds, and the so-called conservative peace guerrillas. It was a 10-year period wrapped in homicides, assaults, fights, persecutions, massacres, and destruction of property. At the heart of this period of violence was the power struggle between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party, as well as the internal struggles among their factions. Following the Bogotazo, conservative President Luis Mariano Ospina survives unharmed and ramps up the crackdown on dissent. Due to the levels of violence, the Liberal Party does not participate in the presidential elections of 1950 and calls to disregard the government, which leaves the way clear for the conservative Laureano Gomez to win the presidential post that same year. On the side of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, after his outstanding combat against the liberal uprisings, the general is appointed delegate of Colombia to the Supreme Command of the United Nations military forces in Washington. A year later, in 1950, after continuing to show excellent performance and continuing to gain the trust of various political and military leaders, Rojas Pinilla achieves his top military rank when the acting president of the Republic, Dr. Roberto Urdaneta Arbeláez, appoints him as the general commander of the Armed Forces of Colombia. Now, during these early 50s, in the decade of violence, the conflicts of violent and political disputes had increased their volume, and there was no political formula that could achieve a solution. The early years of the 50s showed the worst death and violence figures of this entire stage. From the state forces and from the liberal and communist armed groups, there was no intention to give in. At the same time, a governance crisis was developing, where numerous political factions did not recognize the government's institutions or the call it made to a constituent assembly in 1953. Faced with this situation of anarchy and in one of the most violent moments of 1953, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla, along with various groups, make a decision that would mark his life in this stage of Colombia. After a time of deliberations and reflections in front of a society that cried out for peace, a group of military men led by Rojas Pinilla decided in June of '53 to depose the conservative president Roberto Urdaneta, giving a peaceful coup without bloodshed. The group of military men offers the presidency to various renowned politicians, and in the face of their refusal, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla assumes the presidency. The coup by Gustavo Rojas Pinilla was well received by a large part of the population and the political class. He had the support of former presidents and leaders of both parties. He also had the support of the armed forces and the national police. The new government of Gustavo Rojas Pinilla presented itself as a nationalist Christian movement. His program was based on a discourse of peace, justice, and freedom, of order, against anarchy and moral crisis, of patriotism and nationalism to achieve the cohesion and moral restoration of the republic. According to Rojas Pinilla, it was not possible to achieve peace without a social justice that benefited the poorest. The new president said the homeland cannot live peacefully while it has children with hunger and nakedness. So Rojas focuses his government on the restoration of public peace, the implementation of social reforms for the most disadvantaged, and on promoting economic development, employment, and a large infrastructure plan, something that was in line with the developmentalist currents of several Latin American rulers at that time. He did this every time he would maintain a close alliance with the army and the church Rojas Pinillas. The strengthening of the state and Colombian society was proposed based on the social doctrine of the Catholic Church and the ideals of the liberator Simón Bolívar. Thus, the Rojas government begins with the complex challenge of pacifying the country at the time of the greatest excesses of the decade of violence. To do this, he offers amnesty to guerrilla fighters who lay down their arms and economic reconstruction of the areas most affected by violence. This, coupled with military deterrence tactics, led a significant group of guerrillas during his government to eventually lay down their arms. But a few others persisted in rising against the government. In this process of stabilizing the nation, Rojas Pinilla had to confront numerous guerrilla groups using the state's weapons. In turn, the Communist Party was outlawed and various demonstrations were repressed, with the massacre of 11 students in 1954 being remembered. Rojas also maintains a regular confrontation with the press, with a majority of newspapers controlled by his opponents and several even linked to the armed guerrillas. Several of these newspapers were shut down during his term. Over time, with Rojas' policy, the confrontations and clashes of the period called the violence decreased considerably, but Rojas does not manage to completely quell them. And violence continued to be present in Colombian life. In addition to protests over the so-called excesses in the use of government force, Rojas enjoyed substantial bipartisan support early in his term. But as he was creating his own political force, supported by workers, the middle class, and the military, the parties began to withdraw their support. When in 1955, one of his ministers announces the creation of the Popular Action Movement to support Rojas Pinilla, the Liberal and Conservative Party began a strong opposition against Rojas, but we will return to this later. Rojas Pinilla strongly emphasized social policy. During his government, popular, practical, and technological education was strengthened, as well as education with new agricultural technologies and popular culture. Hand in hand with the strengthening of a social assistance network for the most disadvantaged in terms of food, services, and health, Rojas Pinilla stimulates the programs of the Zututenza radio schools, and in his government he starts a novel program throughout the region, known as educational television, which used television as a means to support the education of young people. During his term, television is also introduced in the country, and urban and rural telephony is automated for the strengthening of communications. For Rojas Pinilla, popular culture should not be stimulated with rudimentary means, but by taking advantage of the most advanced technological means. television, radio, theater, printing, and all means to put them to the benefit of the cultural elevation of the masses. Likewise, during Rojas, numerous schools, colleges, and universities were created in the New Granada territory. On his part, during his government, a significant infrastructure and industry plan was carried out, highlighting the following works among them: the completion of the Atlantic Railway, the paving of most of the country's main roads, the creation of the National Learning Service, the People's Bank, the Livestock Bank, as well as important monumental government buildings. Likewise, the construction of El Dorado Airport in Bogotá and the start of construction of 18 more airports was of special significance. Similarly, aqueducts, sewers, avenues, roads were built and different regions of Colombia were electrified. During his administration, the Echerías Paz del Rio steel mill, the Chinquinquira milk plant, and the military hospital were completed. In turn, the hydroelectric dam of the new Barranca Bermeja refinery was completed. The Bogotá-Chía Highway, the National Administrative Center, the Military Club, and the Astronomical Observatory were built, among many other works. Another very popular measure to this day by Rojas Pinilla was to have been the first president of Colombia to grant political rights to women. This was a revolutionary event in the South American subcontinent, as it made the Colombian nation one of the first to promote women's right to vote. Another important aspect of his social policy was the creation of the institution National Secretariat of Social Assistance, that is, the National Secretariat of Social Assistance, which was led by his daughter, Maria Eugenia Rojas de Moreno. National Secretariat of Social Assistance sponsored popular markets, gifts for poor children, school restaurants, child care centers, and created social welfare centers in cities and fields. In turn, Rosa Pinilla also developed several projects in the area of popular housing, the peasant house, the peasant insurance, and the job exchange. In addition to carrying out numerous social works for the victims of violence, another striking aspect was her foreign policy. She had ambiguous love-hate relationships with several South American rulers, particularly with her Venezuelan counterpart, Marcos Pérez Jiménez. On the other hand, her relations with the United States were strong and solid, giving special benefits and guarantees to American companies in the exploitation of Colombian resources. Despite the fact that violence had decreased and the government was making progress in reducing poverty and ensuring greater institutional order, clashes and political conflicts in the country continued, in addition to various student agitations. In 1954, Rojas Pinilla had been re-elected by the Constituent Assembly, and for 1957 he was seeking re-election once again. In 1953, his coup was met with applause. Over the years, Rojas Pinilla's government had become uncomfortable for a series of internal and external interests in Colombia. When Rojas showed that he would form his own political base, the conservatives and liberals turned against him. Starting from the year 56, conservatives and liberals were achieving greater dialogue and reconciliation and formed a bipartisan pact, united this time by their opposition to Rojas. This is added to the fact that the United States decides to abandon support for Rojas and close international credit lines for his government. In 1957, political conflict intensifies when a new Constituent Assembly announces the upcoming re-election of Rojas, and the opposition leader, Guillermo León Valencia, is arrested. Rojas's opponents, who had been plotting his overthrow, escalate protests, strikes, stoppages, and talks with the military. After several days of civil strike and having lost the support of the United States and part of the army and the church, Rojas decides to announce his resignation on May 10th of 1957, leaving in power a military government junta. This military junta is dedicated to taking the steps that allow a transition of the country towards new governments, of those registered in the bipartisan agreement known as the National Front. Between the year 1958 and 1959, the National Front government puts the military government of Pinilla on trial. General Rojas Pinilla appears before the Senate to defend himself against the accusations against him. The verdict of the National Congress on March 18, 1959 was condemnatory against General Rojas. However, 7 years later, the Superior Court of Cundinamarca restores his political rights in October of 1967. A year later, the Supreme Court of Justice confirms this judicial act. As a result of this sentence, Rojas Pinilla and his associates are allowed to found the National Popular Alliance movement, a party based on the patriotic and nationalist ideals of Rojas Pinilla, and it allows in turn for people of various ideologies to join the alliance, becoming a party with sectors ranging from the left to the right. The National Popular Alliance movement, under the command of Rojas Pinilla, participates in the legislative elections of '68, and even with a somewhat improvised and accident-prone campaign, they obtained 16% of the votes, becoming the third most voted party in the country, behind the Liberals and Conservatives. Thanks to these election results, Rojas Pinilla begins to emerge as a candidate with serious possibilities to win the presidential elections, and the ruling class of the time begins to look unfavorably at this aspiration. Against him were the press, the traditional political parties, and the national government, since on one occasion President Lares Restrepo proclaimed in a speech the need to defeat Rojas in the elections, a fact that was considered a violation of the president's impartiality during election times. The truth is that the elections were held and they were quite contentious, giving 51% of the votes to Pastrana and 49% of the votes to Rojas Pinilla. However, Rojas Pinilla and his supporters opposed the official results, labeling them as fraud and doubting their veracity. In the face of this situation, the April 19th guerrilla movement emerges, arguing that if power could not be obtained through an electoral process, it would be through force. Later, this movement would receive international recognition with the takeover of the Palace of Justice, which ended with the death of 11 magistrates and more than a dozen dead. However, Rojas Pinilla does not live long enough to see this event that would mark the history of his country, as he dies of a heart attack on his farm in Melgar on January 17, 1975. His burial was in Bogotá, where he lay in state in the national capital. Thus ended this controversial stage of Colombian history, which for the first time so clearly broke with the endless struggle between conservatives and liberals. His political ideas of patriotism as a guarantee of unity of a conservative socialism in the Colombian style, with a strong market. From the search for social justice, peace, and aid to the needy and disadvantaged, without neglecting economic progress and social development. These were the pillars with which he tried to guide his government until he was overthrown by the usual interests in less than 4 years. Thank you very much to everyone for watching this video. I hope you liked it a lot. Once again, I invite you to check out our new channel, Mysteries of History. I'm sure you're going to love it. Also, I invite you to leave a like on this video and to leave your comments. We're always very interested in hearing your impressions, and of course, we hope you'll share it on all your social media. See you in the next video, and may God bless you.